We will now recess the budget sub and convene the extraordinary session hearing. Secretary, will you please call the roll?
Skinner.
I'm here.
Bloom. Chavez.
Here.
Daly. Gorell.
Here.
Harkey. Jones Sawyer.
Present.
Arasucci. Weber.
So, members, before we begin, I'll remind you that this is an informational hearing, and I want to recognize and welcome Speaker John Perez, Governor Brown. The purpose of this hearing is to discuss the proposal for the reserve or rainy day fund that has been introduced under the extraordinary session, and I would like to just remind committee members, some of you were members of the Assembly when we adopted a previous measure, ACA 4, that basically, in my opinion, would have put some undue hardships on our ability, while it recognized the fact that we, as a state, are better by building up some reserves so that we can cushion against volatility. It really tied our hands a bit in terms of being able to access funds for such things as paying down debt or other needs that we may have. Rather than my commenting on the benefits or values of our current proposal, I will turn it over to Mr. Speaker to open to discuss the proposal.
Thank you, Madam Chair, members. I'm pleased to present AB 2X1, which seeks to put before the voters the question of creating a meaningful rainy day fund for our state budget. Before I speak to the merits of this legislation, I'd like to take a moment and speak to why this legislation is vital to California's future. Over the past 4 years, we've worked tirelessly with the governor to put California's fiscal house in order. We've made the difficult decisions necessary to bring our expenditures within line of our revenues. We've given the voters the confidence that they needed to approve new revenues and end the cycle of cuts to education and public safety. And as a result, we've turned the corner, and we've now seen a decade of multi-billion-dollar deficits turn into a few years of multi-billion-dollar reserves. Our credit rating has improved, having received across-the-board increases from all three major rating agencies for the first time since November of 2004. We have an opportunity to break the cycle of boom and bust of the past. By putting forward this rainy day fund for consideration by the voters, we can take advantage of this unique opportunity to ensure that our hard-won fiscal stability continues. We cannot afford to fall back into the bad habits of the past, where we committed to ongoing spending and tax cuts in good years, and then were forced to pass major cuts and tax increases on the middle class in bad years. The rainy day fund we're considering today will put California on track to continue our progress in making California a model for fiscal responsibility well into the future. Now, with respect to the merits of this legislation, this rainy day fund replaces the existing flawed rainy day fund with a genuine mechanism for capturing excess revenues each year that can be held in reserve for years where our revenues fall off. In broad terms, this constitutional amendment replaces both existing Prop 58 constitutional reserve and the proposed ACA 4. The Prop 58 reserve is generally considered weak and ineffectual, and ACA 4 is an overly complicated spending cap that could limit our ability to pay down debts and fully fund our schools. AB 2X1, by contrast, establishes a bigger constitutional reserve of 10% of our general reserve, fills the reserve with spiking capital gains that exceed 6.5% of the general fund, and that's once you've accounted for your Prop 98 obligation. This provides a common sense mechanism to filling a reserve. Typical years will result in modest contributions. Boom years will result in large contributions, and bad years will result in no contribution in most cases, since all revenues will be needed to balance the budget and to limit cuts and tax increases. AB 2X1 enables funds that would otherwise go to the rainy day fund to instead be used to accelerate repayment of budget debt and unfunded liabilities. This is a key element that the governor has put forward. This measure creates a targeted Prop 98 reserve that will capture spiking Prop 98 revenues, but only after the existing maintenance factor is repaid and we're certain that we're in test 1 years. This is another element added by the governor. It requires checks and balances and accountability to withdrawal rainy day funds and suspension of transfers. No longer will the governor be able to make these key decisions unilaterally and with no conditions. Instead, the governor will have to declare a fiscal emergency, and the legislature will have to agree to either a withdrawal or a suspension. We limit withdrawals from the rainy day fund to ensure that balances last at least 2 years, to protect against multi-year downturns and avoid simply draining the entire reserve in 1 year and put off all the tough decisions for the next. In addition, the reserve requirements I have just outlined. This proposal will insulate the spending side of the budget from the problems of our roller coaster boom and bust revenues. Some have argued that there should be other ways to deal with boom and bust, but I think that this really does hit the mark. This proposal reflects a genuine effort to ensure stability in California's revenues by taking revenue spikes off the table. Instead of committing those temporary spikes to ongoing purposes, they can be preserved to stabilize California's budget in bad revenue years and avoid draconian cuts and middle-class tax increases in those bad years as well. This will help preserve the budget stability we've worked so hard to achieve the past few years and help lock in California's remarkable financial turnaround. Today is an important step in getting this through the legislature, and I look forward to working with you in the coming weeks to finalize this amendment. With that, I'd like to introduce the Governor of California, Governor Brown.
Thank you, John. This is a great opportunity to exercise restraint on an ongoing basis, to communicate to the voters of California that this legislature is serious about handling their money, and not just for 1 year, but over a longer time horizon. There's never a magic formula. Every mechanism we can think of will raise questions, and I urge you to look at this particular proposal, examine it. But what I would hope at the end of the day is that the Republican members and the Democratic members, to a great extent, come together and support a rainy day fund. And then it goes before the voters after the Senate would vote for it, and we would have a very strong basis of support for the campaign. That's the idea of this measure. It's both flexibility to pay down debt, but it's also an opportunity to build a renewed vote of confidence from both sides of the political aisle. We all know there's a lot of skepticism about government. Probably it comes because of we're somewhat distant from the average voter here and all the very complicated things that you do. But there's nothing complicated about the idea of saving money, having a reserve. And if you remember my little card that I showed you during my State of the State speech, on the back I had my dog Sutter say that every dog always wants to keep a bone in the backyard. So this is kind of a set of bones for our backyard, because we don't know what we may need to chew on if the capital gains goes awry. So there it is. It's relatively simple. Voters can understand it. And maybe the most important point I would make is that self-restraint is really what this is about. But it's putting the restraint into the Constitution, laying it out for a number of years. And that, I think, is a very important statement. Now, it's not easy. Some people are going to say, why ever restrain ourselves? There's so many good ideas here that this will curb some of them. Well, that's the idea. There is some curb, because if you don't curb, you will go back into this constant recurrence of debt, boom and bust, red and black. And if you remember to look at the budget, the deficits over the last 12 years are far more predominant than the surpluses. This is an effort to make more surpluses by far than deficits. So I would urge you to think about it, work on it, offer your suggestions, but let's show the people of California that this legislature is about doing their business, not about scoring points for one interest group or another.
Thank you, Governor and Speaker Perez, for the presentation. Before we have the committee members make comments or questions, I wanted to see if there are any witnesses in support of the bill.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Mr. Speaker and the Governor. California Forward has been supportive of this activity. I'm Fred Silva with California Forward. We've been at this for some years. There are co-equal goals here. One goal is to capture resources that are spiked in terms of revenue. The other is to bolster the reserve. We hope that as this process goes that you'll find ways to keep the reserve bolstered, because in the end it's the non-98 side of the budget that is affected by these major cuts. So always think about health and social services and higher education when you're thinking about bolstering the reserve. Thank you very much.
Madam Chair, members, Michael Hulsizer here on behalf of the Kern County Superintendent of Schools Office. We have 170,000 students, 47 school districts in our county. We're in strong support of this measure for two reasons. First, this is the one rainy day fund that specifically addresses the root cause of spiking in revenue and creating unsustainable expenditures. And that's, as Speaker Perez said, it directly links to capital gains. No other rainy day fund has done that, and so we support it for that reason. Secondly, we support it because it actually involves schools in the solution. Let's make no mistake, schools were hit the hardest of any sector in this budget in the last recession. Schools took $15.2 billion of cuts, $6 billion of that ongoing, $1,000 per student. We took another $7 billion in deferrals and $2 billion more in one-time cuts. We weren't protected in the last budget. It would be a mistake to think that by playing possum we're going to be protected with a new rainy day fund. We need to be a part of that solution. Schools are directly impacted by spikes in capital gains, and we need to be a part of the solution. The Speaker and Governor have crafted a solution that protects schools. As the Speaker said very specifically, this rainy day fund would require all maintenance factor and all debts to schools to be repaid before any deposits are made in the Prop 98 reserve. And then secondly, the Governor and the Speaker are very carefully protecting Proposition 98 and committing to honor it. Deposits will only be made in test 1 years. No maintenance factor will ever be created in a year when a deposit is made. And whenever we spend out of the reserve, we'll spend it respecting the integrity of Proposition 98. The Governor's people have said, and I believe them, we won't be making bond payments. We won't be making CalSTRS payments out of this money. It'll be spent on legitimate Proposition 98 expenditures. We encourage you to approve this measure. Thank you.
Any other witnesses in support? Or, if there are others, I wish you'd come up now because I'm about to call the witnesses in opposition.
Estelle Lemieux with the California Teachers Association. We currently do not have a position on this bill, but there's some good things and not so good things. So I'll give you CTA's principles. We believe, as the measure does, that all funding of these cuts should be restored and paid back before any funding or revenues be placed in the Prop 98. Like the measure does, full COLA and growth be funded as well before we put any revenues in the Prop 98 reserve. We believe that there should be a provision included that no manipulation of Proposition 98 should be allowed. We also believe that revenue should not be placed in Proposition 98 reserve when there's a maintenance factor that's outstanding or when the year that one is being created. And that could almost be at the same time. So, and it's not quite clear in the statute if that's what the language states at this time. It's not clear to us. We also believe that this measure protects the state from these spikes. We would like to see Proposition 98 be protected when the spikes go downward, because we do take the heaviest hits, as you well know, as we have in the last several years. So these are our concerns, and we look forward to working and continuing to work with the Speaker and the Governor's office on these concerns. Thank you.
Thank you. So any other tweeners or witnesses in opposition? All right, seeing none, I'd like to make a few comments, and then perhaps my vice chair, and then we will see if other committee members have either questions or comments. I don't know how, I'm sure that my new colleagues are kind of tired of hearing from those of us who were elected in 2008 and just watched before our very eyes the entire general fund balance basically vanish. It was traumatizing. And certainly people like myself did not come to the Assembly to gut our schools, to gut the programs for people with disabilities, to force people on SSI to live at levels that we paid them in the late 80s, or to do any other number of things that we had to do in order to deal with the bleeding revenues. Now, I would hope that we would never have to face the kind of economic disaster that we did in 2008. But we know we did. There was the Depression, there was, and I'm not all that confident in terms of the actions that have been taken by the federal government in relationship to protections on banks or Wall Street. I'm not all that confident that there's been enough safeguards put into place to help prevent that type of downturn. So what is it that we do? Now, we know that even with this proposal, that the expectation at this moment, I believe, if this were in place, that by 2017, and correct me please, Mr. Speaker, if I'm incorrect, but by 2017 we would achieve a reserve of about $8 billion under this proposal, or?
It would depend on the levels of revenues each year and whether or not they were spiking above the 6.5 level. What we've known is historically, if you look back over the last 20 years, general fund revenues attributable to income from capital gains fluctuate anywhere from 3% to 14.5% over the last 20 years. If they continued to come in at those levels, then we'd be able to build decent levels of reserves, but I think it's hard to pinpoint it to a specific number without knowing what the revenues will be like over those years. But 6.5% is a very good number to look at spiking when you look back over 20 years. What we do know as well is, had we put this in place before, this kind of a reserve fund would have all but eliminated any budgetary impacts of the dot-com bust recession at the beginning of the century, and it would have cut in half the budgetary impacts of the Great Recession. So it's easier to give specific answers in a retrospective look than it is to project going forward.
Right. Well, I appreciate that that historic perspective. That what the point I was going to make is that if we had the kind of downturn that we experienced in 2008, even this type of proposal wouldn't fully protect us. But if we can imagine, and I think all of us could without much imagination whatsoever, that we could experience the kind of downturns that we experienced during the dot-com bust, then a proposal like this definitely would give us some of that cushion. And if I can speak to my problems with the ACA 4 that is now currently on the ballot, beyond the aspects of it that were somewhat like a spending cap, the limitation on our ability to utilize it to pay down debt, when I think we all know if in our own personal lives, in our households, if we have high interest debt, then one of the first things that we want to do is get rid of that debt before we even start saving. We want to pay down that debt because high interest debt, especially now with the type of interest rates that are available on savings or even on the returns in stock market, can totally eat up anything you might gain from other types of savings. So I like the way this is crafted in terms of that ability for us to pay down California's debt, which I think helps us in downturns also. I wanted to reiterate that I just spoke about ACA 4. Now, if I compare it to Prop 58, which we live under now, that compared to our current Prop 58 reserve, this proposal would free up some general fund monies in ordinary years to invest in such things as higher ed. We know that Prop 98 protects or at least helps us give some assurance to our K through 12 schools and our community colleges, but we have little to no assurances for our CSU or our UC system, for example, our courts or our healthcare programs. So I like that it gives us a little more flexibility in that regard, and also that it takes the very thing that part of why California has some of the boom busts that we have is the volatility in our revenues, and it's the capital gains that contributes much to that volatility. So it takes the very thing that contributes to the volatility and it captures it to help soften the impact of the volatility. So those are aspects I like. I welcome analysis and review of this proposal by entities like we heard from CTA so far, but others that know the budget intimately or have longer experience, so that we, as we move this forward, that we can make sure that, well, nothing is, you can't always predict any unintended consequence. We certainly want to review it very carefully, so if we can see an aspect of it that needs tweaking that would prevent a consequence that we may not intend, that we still have time right now to do that. So that said, I will turn to my Vice Chair, Mr. Gurel, Assemblymember Gurel.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Governor, and Mr. Speaker. Thank you for, first of all, thank you for continuing the conversation about how to save additional monies as they come into Sacramento beyond the projections, rather than the conversation about how to spend additional revenues that come in. I think that that's a healthy conversation, and I'm glad it continues. Building consensus around this, or trying to build consensus around this, is a thoughtful thing to do. I think it needs to leave this building with bipartisan support if it's going to have any chance at all before voters in November. ACA 4 was a byproduct of a bipartisan effort to get together and figure out what makes sense, what's fiscally responsible. I have to concede that there are some issues with ACA 4 now as it exists on the ballot. One is that it's likely to be moved again with a simple majority vote to another ballot, and there's just not a whole lot that the minority party can do about that. The other is that there are some dates, baselines, timelines that are currently in the wording of ACA 4 that are likely now to be outdated, outmoded, and unfortunately we would probably have to edit and modify it, amend it, if we even wanted to continue with ACA 4. So we look to developing consensus across the aisle on what makes sense. And the first thing is that, and looking at the reports submitted by the Legislative Analyst's Office, it's important that we recognize that capital gains are volatile and not always as predictable as we like. And I think that we'd like to have a conversation consistent with what California Forward has recommended, and that is looking at perhaps a hybrid model whereby not only are we capturing some portion of the capital gains, but some portion of the general fund as well, so that we have some reliability, some consistency, and some adequacy built into what we can expect on a year-by-year basis coming into the reserve fund. The other thing is, as we move forward and build consensus on, is when do we take money out of that fund? There's been some conversations about it requiring a two-thirds vote requirement. There's some logic to that. First of all, two-thirds vote requirement are currently two-thirds votes are currently required for urgency legislation in this building. The second thing is the two-thirds vote really does create some rigidity. It does create some requirement to look internally for efficiencies that we struggled to find in the last couple of years, and did so in many different areas. You yourself, Governor, built in efficiencies as a result of the downturn in the economy into various agencies in your own horseshoe, in your own administration. If we have a $20 billion gap and there's $20 billion in the reserve, it becomes fairly easy politically and process-wise to take that money and plug it in that gap without going through some of the processes we went through the last 3 or 4 years that forced the administration, the agency, the various bureaucracies and commissions to reevaluate their roles, their positions, the way they deal with customer service, and we've done that. And we've done that, and the UCs, for example, have eliminated some positions. They still operate. They're still doing well. They're still world-class institutions. The rigidity around how we take money out does force an examination internally for efficiencies that we don't want to lose track of, because just taking $20 billion and plugging a $20 billion gap, we may lose sight of that process of forcing efficiencies. Another comment as it regards to debt. It's important to pay down debt, but it's also important to have a balance in not only paying down the debt, but having additional revenues available for when the economy dips. And I think that there's a healthy conversation that could take place as we move forward on what portion of the additional revenues that come in would be attributed to debt, what would go into a reserve. We don't, if we get a little bit of money additionally in our paycheck, we don't necessarily put all of that into our debt. Maybe we'll pay down a little bit of that and save some of it if we're not sure that the paycheck will be there for the next month as a family and as an individual. And that's kind of how we want to think about this rainy day fund. We want to ensure that we have flexibility and don't necessarily put all of that toward debt. And those are some of the guidelines that we're looking for, and also a robust conversation as we embrace a rainy day fund, a robust conversation about how to grow the economy. I think we always need to continue to focus on growing the economy, supporting our job creators and our folks. We had some bad news today with Toyota leaving California and headed out of state to Texas, and if we want those spikes in revenue, if we want the additional beyond projection income coming to Sacramento, it's going to be important that not only do we create a rainy day fund into which money can go, but we stimulate an economy and get that economy moving and to get that so we have the additional revenues that come in. So those are some of the things that we're looking at as we want to develop consensus and create a bipartisan instrument that'll leave this building and hopefully be met with support by voters that are often very cynical about some of the things that leave the building and make it to the ballot. But I guess I want to start maybe with a question, and that is, would you, Mr. Speaker and the Governor, as you develop this, would you entertain a two-thirds vote requirement for taking money out of the rainy day fund?